Joe was kind enough to send me a copy of it so I could copy it. And so I took some information out of it. We're now standing in Morleyville. We were standing in Morleyville over on the other road, too. Morleyville wasn't a little community. Morleyville was an area. Okay? But there was a community. They called it downtown. So I don't know how many of the 400 people that, or 500 people that belonged to Morleyville lived here, but out in that field was a community. The community that got burned to the ground by the mobs. So that's why you don't see anything. Logs that burn to the ground don't leave much. So you're not going to see much. It could be called your Rome, as we were mentioned before. It thrived between 1839 and 1845. So for 6 years, this was a thriving community. We're 25 miles south of Nauvoo. And in the fall of 1845, 2 times, the mobs came through here and burned. We'll talk a little bit about that. They first arrived here, and the Mormons first arrived here 1838-39. By 1845, there were 15,000 people out in this part of Illinois. I guess counting Nauvoo and everything. And, of course, the prophet was murdered on the 27th of June, 1844. And it wasn't long after that that they were driven out, including the people that were here in Morleyville. This was part of a ring of settlements. We mentioned that before. Other ones were La Harpe, Macedonia, Camp Creek, Bear Creek, Knowlton Settlement, Highland Branch, Montebello, and Morley's Settlement, among many others. Isaac Morley. We've all heard his name, right? Because Anna was sealed to him before she went west. Isaac Morley is the reason we were here. Because, of course, this is Morleyville. Isaac was born in Massachusetts in 1786, fought in the War of 1812, married Lucy Gunn, and converted to Mormonism in the very early 1830s, and he served as a missionary and then a patriarch. Morley had a farm in Kirtland, and the Morley farm was used by the people that left New York to go settle. When the people that were uprooted from the New England area and went through New York, most of them went to the Morley farm to settle. That's where our family first met Isaac. Okay? And from there, when they went to Missouri, the Mormon part of the family that was in Kirtland, they followed Isaac. And so he was there. And then the logic is, he leaves Missouri to come here. The family sticks with Isaac. He's their patriarch. He's their leader. He wasn't a patriarch at that point, but he was their leader. And so they followed him along with many other families. And they settled in this little area here. When Morley got here in March of 1839, there was one building here. Somebody had settled here prior to that and abandoned it. And there was this one abandoned building out in here. So Isaac took it and worked on it, and it became his home. And from that, about 400 to 500 people settled out here. That had, like I said, a little business section down here. And the city, though, the community was mainly farms. And it was between 2 or 3 square miles. That square that we were in was part of Morleyville. This is a different square mile area. It's part of Morleyville. We go up and we will make a left-hand turn on Avenue or Road 100. That's a mile up from that road we were on, the dirt road. The area above that was Morleyville. So it encompassed 3-4 square miles of land, farmland. And sections, if you get one of those section maps, 29, 31, and 32 mainly. The town site, they're talking about Morley Settlement, downtown, was about 48 acres square. And they had lots that were 198 feet square. The streets were 66 feet wide. Anybody know why they had to have wide streets? Yeah, so you can turn a wagon around. Same reason why Salt Lake has those nice wide streets. Because it goes back to 1847. You had to have enough room to make a U-turn with a wagon. And so the streets here were 66 feet wide, with the main street 82.5 feet wide. So I guess if you had really big wagons, you could turn them on the main street. Okay, Morleyville and Lima, which is the next town south, about 3 miles, were combined into a church unit called the Lima Branch. And they called it, or they might have called it a stake also in those days. You might find records to the Lima stake. It was just a branch of the church out here. And on October 22nd, Isaac Morley became the president of the branch. He also was the magistrate. He was the justice of the peace. He did everything out here, and then became the patriarch. And in October of 1842, there were 424 members in that Lima Morleyville branch. I don't know how many members were down in Lima. There must have been a bunch. So probably figure 200-300 here and another 150 down there. And so there was a fairly good-sized group. There was a guy, Foster Walker, came out here and visited. And I like what he said. This is what he said. There's between 40 and 50 cabins, all on one street, talking about downtown. All had gardens. There were 4 stores. Morley had a cooper shop. He made barrels. And Frederick Cox had a chair-making shop. They don't talk about our Carters and their blacksmith shops, but they had blacksmith shops, I'm sure. There were no stoves, so cooking was done over open fireplaces. So our families had open fireplaces to cook under. Corn flour was more common than wheat flour. Settlers enjoyed the wild strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries that grew in abundance, as well as walnuts, hickory nuts, and butternuts. They erected a church in 1842, and it served as their school. And it says many visits of early LDS leaders were here. Joseph Smith came here and preached. So our ancestors got to meet Joseph down here if they didn't meet him up in Nauvoo, because he was here several times preaching in the church down here. Okay? It was surrounded by a lot of anti-Mormons. That's the problem. You know, you figure you're 25 miles south of town, you're safe. No. Green Plains, which is just 5 miles north of here, was one of the centers of anti-Mormon activity. It was mainly those people, I think, that came down here and mobbed the settlement here. Warsaw was only 10 miles away. Warsaw is where the mob came from to kill Joseph Smith. Most of the mob came from Warsaw. And so that wasn't that far from here either. So they weren't really that far away. You could ride a horse in 3 hours, 2-3 hours, and be over here. So it was easy for the mobs to get here. So it was from Warsaw that many of the people came to kill Joseph. I mentioned that. Almost done. Come on. Okay, 12 days before Joseph was martyred in mid-June, anti-Mormons made their first visit to Morleyville. Okay, so to put in context, Joseph's still alive. 12 days before he died, the anti-Mormon mob first appeared here. They went to Isaac Morley and they gave him an ultimatum. And this was the ultimatum. They had 3 choices. Take up arms and join the vigilantes, or move your family to Nauvoo, or surrender all your arms to the vigilantes and remain neutral and you can stay out here. So those were the 3 options that our families had. Either join the mob, give up your weapons and stay neutral, or move. And the Mormons didn't go for any of those 3. They settled for option 4, which was to stay. And just stay faithful to their church. So Joseph was killed in June. Come September 8th, the mobs met in a church north of here and decided to come down here. They fired on the town. Nobody was hurt. The next night, the mob came and burned several homes. This would be September 9th, 1844. And then on the 10th and the 11th, 29 more homes were burned. So they started in on this area at that point. So that's 29 and, what did I say, several. So 30, 40 homes had already been burned. There's a lot more than 30 or 40 homes out here. We're talking 100 homes probably total. A local resident recalled this in 1880 and said that the anti-Mormons would go from house to house and warn the inmates out. In other words, they go up to your family's home and warn you and say you need to get out of your home. I mean, this was done mainly in a civilized manner. You can call mobs civilized, but a little different than you might have anticipated. Warn the inmates out, tell them that they were going to burn it. Usually there would be no resistance. All hands, including the vigilantes, would help empty the house out of all your belongings. I mean, so they really did this, if you want to be sarcastic about it, very civilly. To go in and help the family move their stuff out and then torch the place. When everybody was out of danger, they would burn it. And then your family would be without a home. They'd have to move to somebody else's house or move up to Nauvoo, which is what most of them did. September 13th, the mobbing continued, and the mob desired to burn Morleyville to the ground. 44 more buildings were burned that day. Now, you remember, they weren't just here. They were over in Carter's property. They were up here where the Durfees lived. They were all over the place burning properties. On Sunday, September 14th, 134 teams, that means 134 wagons, were dispatched down to Lima, down to here. This was called Lima, of course, the church branch. 134 wagons were sent down here to help bring the refugees back to Nauvoo on September 13th, to help evacuate everybody that was left. The following weeks, the burnings continued, and more homes were destroyed. All the saints that moved back to Nauvoo came with thousands of pounds of harvested grain. That was the important thing, and the mobs apparently didn't destroy the grain, but they brought back thousands of pounds of grain for the people in Nauvoo to eat. And then, of course, that brought to poor Edmund Durfee his end. Because after these burnings, there was a Solomon Mack that stayed here, who was a member. And I would imagine that Mary Jane Dooley and her family stayed, because they weren't Mormons. And so since they didn't have the name Carter, they weren't associated with the Mormons, their homes were still standing, or their home was still standing. And so anyway, Mack was still there. It hadn't been burned. In early November, Solomon and several other saints quietly attempted to gather in their crop of corn. So just think of these fields of corn around here, like that one right there. Come September, it'll be ready to harvest. On Saturday, November 14th, Edmund Durfee arrived here in Morleyville to get a load of grain. He came with a wagon to pick up a load of grain. Unfortunately, November 15th was the same day the mob decided to make one more run through here and burn what was left, and met Edmund. And Edmund became one of the few martyrs. That's why Edmund's a big deal. He was one of the few Mormons that was actually murdered by the mobs here, other than Joseph and Hiram. One of the very few people that died. And his grave's up in that cemetery up the hill in Nauvoo.
Yeah,
the old cemetery. He's the main burial grave that's up there. And so they killed him that night by shooting him. He went out to try to protect the grain, and they shot him dead. One of the very, very few things that happened. Within 3 months of his death, the Exodus began. So, I mean, he almost lived long enough to get out of here safely, but he had to make that one more run to get that last grain so the people would have some corn. And so, unfortunately, that was his bad choice. And so by the fall of 1846, they were all gone. So this is Morleyville. Just understand, that sign represents downtown. But you just turn around and you look around, it's all Morleyville. Now, where were our people? You see the wires down amongst the trees. If you're down low, you might not be able to see the wires out there. Not these wires, but out there's those wires. Those are the high-tension wires along the creek. Our family lived just on the other side of those wires. So they'd have to go down through the creek and come right up here, quarter mile to a half mile max, to come into town. So they lived right in the suburbs, if you want to call it that. They were in the suburbs of Morleyville proper. And so it wasn't very far at all. So, I mean, you've got to be able to visualize. You've got to do like they do in primary with the little kids and teach them how to visualize things. We've got to put our minds back to the 1840s and try to visualize what we could see. Joe, do you have anything you want to add? I bet you do.
Well, I can add one family story.
Okay.
and this is about the instigation of the attacks on Morleyville. As you said, Green Plains. There's a Green Plains schoolhouse along 96, about 5 miles north of here. That building is still here. It's not been constructed into a private residence, but that building is still there. The story is that gunshots were fired through, there was an anti-Mormon meeting in the schoolhouse, and gunshots were fired through the window, and then the mob took off. The question is, who fired the shots? So there's some suspicion that they were fired to instigate the mob, and it wasn't really Mormons who fired the shots. It was somebody.
The mob fired on themselves carefully.
Fired on themselves to instigate that. But I just wanted you to know you will be going by the Green Plains Schoolhouse when you go back to Nauvoo. Then it's on the west side of the highway. And if you watch the buildings along the side, it looks like a square building with a
peaked roof like a schoolhouse would have.
A little porch in front, but it's been converted into a residence, but it's still there.
News to me. So, any questions about Morleyville?
So it's not still called that? Nobody still calls this Morleyville? Or do they?
Pardon?
No, this town
is called Morleyville?
Well, not really. It's unincorporated land. But the sign there is for Morley Settlement. So, I mean, this is Morleyville. Historically...
Those people right there, their address isn't going to be...
No,
there would be Lima.
This is Tioga.
Or Tioga.
Tioga was
They'd be
founded
Tioga.
after
the city of Tioga, well, the community of Tioga was built just north of here. This is the south end of it. So they didn't really build on top of where Morley Settlement was, which is nice for us. Because at least we know out in there was where our family lived. And some of them may have had stores down there or stuff like that. I kind of suspect, my own thoughts, I have no proof, is that either William or Dominicus or both of them had blacksmith shops down here. Yeah. But they could have just been up on the Carter property too. Who knows? You know?
Well, when we were at the records office, I was telling the story that you just told, and a little different version, by the way. And the woman at the records office says, "Oh my goodness." And I said, "What?" And she said, "There was somebody here yesterday telling the same story. And it was his ancestor that got shot." So it wasn't my
Well, I think the best thing that ever happened was 10 years ago, we had our first little mini Carter reunion. We had 8 of us show up, and 2 of them were local people here. And so we took Charles Carter, who runs the family website, carterville.com, was here, and he's a Dominicus descendant. So we went to the record office, because he had never been there. And I told him, you can go in there and get all these neat records from your family there. So we walked in, he goes up to this little missionary and says, "I want to look up my family." And she said, "Well, just go over to that computer there and put in your ancestor's name and we'll help you from there." He walked over to the computer and it had Dominicus's name on the screen.
Oh my God.
So he turned around and went back to this little sister missionary and said, "How'd you do that?" "I walked over there and it's already got his name on there. I didn't even get to put it in." She said, "Oh, well, there was a couple that was just there. And they just walked out as you walked in. They're out in the parking lot probably. Go grab them." And they were a brother and sister missionary that were here, senior missionaries. The wife was a Carter. The husband was a surveyor. And that's how we were able to locate where the cemetery was that year, because her husband's surveyor was able to take that records map and take us right to where things were located. He knew how to plot out quarter miles, an eighth of a mile, and stuff like that. He pinpointed where that cemetery was, just dead on. And then helped me find some of my Barney family property too. And so it was really a very fortuitous thing that we ran into them that year.
Question, Bob.
Yeah.
Varaine's Carter.
Uh-huh.
He's buried in the cemetery here in Tioga.
Yeah.
Now he's the
okay, Varaine's is one of Jeff Zink's ancestors. And we're going to meet a heavyset gentleman when we go up here. Matter of fact, his mom wants to meet you.
Well, because
anyway,
I think her mother
babysat
me.
He's a Carter, but he's through John's brother who came out here, of all things. And so he's not through John, he's through John's brother. And Baraines was one of the brothers, I think it's Richard, if I'm not wrong, his father was Richard. And Richard had a Baraines, and Baraines is Jeff's ancestor. So there's other Carters out here. That's what's crazy. And then another generation further back, there was a descendant that was Leslie Carter, who was the genealogist that really got the genealogy straight on our family, who was not a member. He was from Chicago, but his ancestors settled right out here too during the Mormon period. So there were a bunch of different Carters that came out here.
All sorts of letters from Leslie Carter that my grandmother had.
Yeah, and you met Leslie. Leslie's the guy that figured out that that was Hannah's portrait that you had. Because I think the family wasn't even sure who it was, and he's the one that kind of pinned that finally down to who it had to be. And so he was a great genealogist. He straightened out our pedigree. Prior to that, we had Archibald Bennett, who had married into the Carter family, who was the president of the Genealogy Society of Utah, developed a pedigree that Coleman used in his book, and most of you have Coleman's book probably. The pedigree in there is false. There's a generation left out, totally skipped. And Leslie was able to do original research before the church ever filmed anything. He went to all the archives in New England, town by town, and took pictures of everything himself and pieced the story together. Archibald didn't like him. He didn't like Archibald. So there was some real friction there. And then I wrote a book on the Carter family ancestry that's in the Family History Library, using Leslie's information. And I've been trying to protect that pedigree on Family Search ever since, and it's a full-time job. Because people constantly want to butcher it. Okay, so what we're going to do from here, the next two stops we're not really going to stop. We're going to go up, make a left-hand turn, and go down Road 100. The first time I stop, you're going to be directly north of where we stopped before. We're going to be right next to where Mary Jane lived. We're going to be up here by where that schoolhouse is. We were down here. Now we're going to be up here, north of the property.
There's a tree line there, Bob. You can see where that is.
We're just going to go just past the tree line.
There's a tree line, and you can see where that...
And that's this tree line that you see along here that goes along the creek. And just understand that Mary Jane owned a big section of land there. And that becomes very significant because John's buried right down the road from her house, about 2 miles. But it's on that road that he's buried. And that's why he left all of his stuff to her, basically. That's why that Fletcher Cemetery has to be the place. Plus, Joe's family always said that's where they were buried, where he was buried. Okay, the other place that we really won't stop is when we go on that Road 100 and we reach 96, the highway. At that intersection on the southeast corner is William Folsbury's farm. And William Folsbury owned that big blue area that's off of that intersection. So when we stopped to cross 96, everything on that side of the road and on this side of the road is William Folsbury's big piece of property. Now, he had owned stuff out in the middle here that he sold to his dad. So I don't know, maybe he still lived there. And Dad lived with him, I don't know. But he also owned this big piece of property, which had to be farming land. Just like John's land down south of Phillips was farming land. Remember, that's their main job, was to do farming.
So when you're talking about Philip that came out from Massachusetts, was that John's brother, Philip?
No, this is John's son, Philip. Dominicus and William's brother, who had left Massachusetts or left Maine early and went down into Massachusetts and lived and married there, had a family. And then in 1851 decided to come out here and be with the family, which I think is amazing. That he'd want to come out here where the Mormons were. Probably the family said, hey, you come out here, we've got all this land you can have for next to nothing. And that may have been the thing. Maybe he decided he didn't like crowded Lowell, Massachusetts and wanted to do some farming. They were all raised on a farm in Maine. So, I mean, they were farmers at heart. So that's why he came out here. Became a land baron because, hey, land was cheap by the time he got here. And John turned a pretty penny on him too, because he sold land for a fairly good price and got it for almost